March 12, 1938, Boeing Field, Seattle. Rain hammered the control tower windows like machine gun fire, while meteorologist Frank Morrison squinted through the darkness at weather instruments that painted a grim picture. Visibility 0. Cloud ceiling 50 feet. Wind gusting to 35 knots from the northwest. 3 commercial airliners circled somewhere above the storm, their pilots burning precious fuel, while passengers pressed nervous faces against cabin windows, staring into black nothingness that revealed nothing except their own frightened reflections. Morrison reached for the radio microphone with hands that had guided aircraft through Pacific Northwest weather for 12 years. His voice carried the calm authority that passengers never heard but pilots trusted absolutely. Northwest Flight 23, he announced into the static-filled darkness. Recommend diversion to Portland. Seattle approach impossible under current conditions. But Captain James Mitchell's response crackled back through the radio, with the frustration of a man who understood that Portland meant missed connections, stranded passengers, and airline executives demanding explanations for operational failures that weather created, but company accountants would blame on inadequate planning. "We have fuel for one approach attempt," Mitchell replied, his words carrying the weight of 147 passengers and crew members whose evening plans had dissolved into uncertainty somewhere above the clouds. After that, Portland becomes our only option. The mathematical reality was brutal in its simplicity. Commercial aviation had conquered distance and weather during daylight hours, transforming travel from adventure into routine business necessity. But darkness remained aviation's unconquerable enemy, turning familiar airports into invisible targets that pilots approached through instruments alone, hoping their calculations matched reality. When wheels finally touched pavement, they couldn't see until the moment of contact. In the basement of Seattle's municipal airport, electrical engineer Robert Chen worked by the harsh glare of industrial lighting that cast sharp shadows across workbenches, cluttered with vacuum tubes, copper wire, and testing equipment that looked more like mad scientist apparatus than aviation technology. For 18 months, Chen had been developing a system that aviation authorities had officially classified as experimental and potentially dangerous. His approach lighting concept violated established safety protocols that demanded strict separation between aircraft electrical systems and ground installations. The Federal Aviation Authority had explicitly prohibited any electrical connections between airport lighting and approaching aircraft, citing fire hazards and electromagnetic interference that could disable navigation instruments when pilots needed them most. But Chen possessed the stubborn confidence of an engineer who trusted mathematics over institutional caution. His calculations proved that properly designed electrical circuits could guide aircraft to safe landings under conditions where visual references disappeared entirely. The system he envisioned would create an electrical pathway between aircraft and runway, allowing pilots to follow instrument guidance down to touchdown without requiring visual contact with the ground until the final seconds of approach. Critics throughout the aviation community dismissed his concept as dangerously complex technology that introduced more failure modes than it solved. Even Charles Lindbergh, during a private consultation the previous autumn, had questioned whether electrical systems could operate reliably under weather conditions that already challenged every other aircraft component. The telephone call that would change everything came at 11:47 p.m. from Morrison's control tower. Flight 23 was beginning its final approach through weather that made visual landing impossible, relying entirely on pilot skill and instruments that provided general guidance but couldn't deliver the precision needed for safe touchdown on a rain-slicked runway invisible beneath solid cloud cover. Chen's experimental approach lighting system sat ready in the airport's electrical vault, connected to runway lights through circuits that violated every established safety protocol, but promised to guide aircraft through darkness that had claimed hundreds of lives across America's growing commercial aviation network. The decision to activate Chen's illegal wiring carried risks that extended far beyond technical malfunction. If the system failed and Flight 23 crashed during landing, federal investigators would focus immediately on unauthorized electrical modifications that had bypassed official approval processes. Chen's career would end in congressional hearings and criminal charges for endangering passenger safety through experimental technology that hadn't completed mandatory testing protocols. Boeing Field would face lawsuits and federal sanctions that could shut down operations permanently. But if Chen's calculations proved correct, his electrical guidance system would demonstrate capability that could revolutionize night aviation across America's expanding airline network. Morrison made the call that aviation history would remember as the moment when institutional caution surrendered to engineering innovation under pressure that measured lives against regulations. "Activate the experimental approach system," he ordered, understanding that his career hung in the balance alongside Chen's reputation and 147 passengers who remained unaware that their landing would depend on technology that existed outside official aviation approval. Chen's hands moved across electrical switches with practiced precision, energizing circuits that connected aircraft instruments to runway lighting through electromagnetic signals that created an invisible pathway through the storm. The approach lighting system came alive with electrical energy that transformed Seattle's rain-soaked runway into a beacon, visible to aircraft instruments even when human eyes saw nothing except impenetrable darkness. Sequential lighting patterns created visual references that guided pilots through precisely calculated descent profiles, while radio beacons transmitted navigation signals that aircraft receivers translated into instrument displays showing exact position relative to the runway centerline. For the first time in aviation history, pilots could land aircraft without visual contact with the ground, following electrical guidance that provided precision approaches through weather conditions that had previously grounded all commercial aviation. Captain Mitchell's voice returned through radio static as Flight 23 descended through the cloud layer, following Chen's electrical guidance toward a runway that remained invisible to everyone except the instruments that translated electromagnetic signals into navigational certainty. "Approach lighting system functioning perfectly," he reported, his words carrying amazement that professional pilots rarely allowed into radio communications. "We have precise guidance down to minimums. This changes everything about night operations in adverse weather." The landing itself lasted only seconds, but those moments validated 18 months of engineering development that had proceeded without official sanction through Chen's conviction that mathematics could solve aviation's most dangerous limitation. Flight 23 touched down precisely on centerline with mechanical authority that spoke of guidance systems operating exactly as calculated, bringing 147 passengers safely to Earth through weather that would have forced diversion or worse under conventional landing procedures. The subsequent flights that night demonstrated consistent performance that proved Chen's experimental system could operate reliably under conditions that challenged every other aircraft component. As dawn broke over Seattle's municipal airport, revealing runways that had remained invisible throughout the storm, Chen stood beside equipment that had transformed theoretical calculations into operational reality. His illegal wiring had accomplished what aviation experts considered impossible, creating electrical guidance that enabled safe landings through weather conditions that had previously grounded commercial aviation entirely. But the implications extended far beyond a single stormy night in Seattle, into questions about how rapidly aviation technology could evolve when engineers possessed the courage to challenge institutional limitations that prioritized regulatory compliance over operational capability. The Federal Aviation Authority's response would determine whether Chen's innovation represented the future of night aviation or a dangerous precedent that undermined safety protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of experimental modifications he had implemented without official approval. The technology worked perfectly, but federal regulations existed for reasons that extended beyond bureaucratic caution into hard-learned lessons about aviation safety that had been written in the blood of pilots who had tested experimental systems that failed under conditions where failure meant death. There began investigation at 8:30 a.m. on March 13th, when Federal Aviation Authority Inspector Harold Garrison arrived at Boeing Field carrying briefing documents that could end Chen's career and shut down unauthorized electrical modifications that had operated outside regulatory oversight for 18 months. Garrison possessed the methodical bearing of a man who had investigated 43 aircraft accidents, each one teaching him that deviation from established safety protocols created failure modes that killed pilots and passengers, regardless of engineering intentions. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected harsh fluorescent lighting as he examined Chen's approach lighting installation, with the systematic thoroughness that had made him the FAA's most feared compliance officer. Chen stood beside equipment that had performed flawlessly the previous night, watching Garrison document every unauthorized connection with photographic precision that would accompany federal reports questioning whether experimental technology should operate at commercial airports without completing mandatory safety certification. The electrical circuits that had guided 3 aircraft to safe landings violated specific regulations that prohibited direct connections between ground installations and aircraft navigation systems. Federal law required 18 months of testing, environmental certification, and operational approval before new aviation technology could be deployed at facilities serving commercial passengers. Behind them, airport operations continued with mechanical routine that masked the bureaucratic storm gathering around Chen's innovation. Northwest Airlines maintenance crews performed routine inspections on Flight 23, the aircraft that had demonstrated perfect landing capability through Chen's electrical guidance system. Passengers who had experienced the smoothest approach in recent memory departed the terminal completely unaware that their safety had depended on technology that existed outside federal aviation regulations. The disconnect between operational success and regulatory compliance created tensions that would determine whether innovation could advance faster than institutional approval processes. Garrison's preliminary inspection revealed engineering sophistication that challenged his assumptions about unauthorized modifications typically found at commercial airports. Chen's approach lighting system represented months of careful design work that addressed electromagnetic interference, power supply redundancy, and failure mode analysis with professional competence that exceeded many certified aviation systems. The electrical connections violated regulations but demonstrated understanding of aviation requirements that suggested systematic engineering rather than amateur experimentation. This wasn't backyard tinkering that endangered aircraft operations through ignorant modifications of safety-critical systems. The technical documentation that Chen provided revealed design philosophy that prioritized operational safety over regulatory compliance, creating systems that functioned reliably under conditions where approved technology remained inadequate for commercial aviation requirements. His electromagnetic guidance system used radio frequencies that didn't interfere with aircraft instruments, while providing navigation accuracy that exceeded existing approach lighting capabilities by significant margins. Power supply circuits included redundant backup systems that maintained operation even if primary electrical sources failed during aircraft approaches, when guidance loss would prove catastrophic. Inspector Garrison found himself confronting evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between regulatory approval and operational safety in rapidly evolving aviation technology. Chen's unauthorized system demonstrated superior performance compared to approved approach lighting that frequently failed during adverse weather conditions when pilots needed guidance most desperately. The mathematical calculations supporting electromagnetic guidance showed engineering competence that exceeded certification requirements for officially approved aviation systems currently operating at airports across America's commercial aviation network. The morning progressed with systematic evaluation that revealed how Chen had solved technical problems that had challenged aviation engineers for decades without official recognition or institutional support. His approach lighting created visual references that remained visible through weather conditions that defeated conventional systems, while radio guidance provided navigation precision that eliminated pilot uncertainty during critical approach phases. Most significantly, the electromagnetic interference concerns that had motivated federal regulations proved unfounded when proper electrical isolation techniques prevented signal contamination that could affect aircraft instruments. By noon, Garrison's investigation had documented technical capabilities that forced reconsideration of regulatory frameworks that might be inhibiting aviation safety improvements rather than protecting passenger welfare through bureaucratic oversight. Chen's experimental system had prevented 3 potential diversions or worse during a single storm, demonstrating operational value that transcended regulatory compliance issues. The performance data collected during the previous night's operations showed guidance, accuracy, and reliability that exceeded specifications for approved approach lighting systems currently installed at major airports throughout the commercial aviation network. The broader implications extended beyond Chen's specific installation into questions about how rapidly aviation technology could advance when regulatory approval processes required years of certification for innovations that demonstrated immediate operational benefits. American aviation was expanding rapidly, with new routes, larger aircraft, and passenger volumes that demanded technological capabilities exceeding current approved systems. Engineers across the country were developing solutions to operational problems that killed pilots and passengers while waiting for federal approval processes that moved with bureaucratic deliberation rather than operational urgency. Chen's case represented a fundamental conflict between engineering innovation and institutional control that would determine whether American aviation could maintain technological leadership in rapidly evolving global markets. His approach lighting system worked perfectly, but federal regulations existed to prevent unauthorized modifications that could create catastrophic failures under conditions where experimental technology proved inadequate for operational requirements. The tension between innovation and oversight reflected broader challenges facing industries where technological advancement occurred faster than regulatory frameworks could adapt to changing operational realities. Inspector Garrison completed his preliminary evaluation with conclusions that would influence federal policy regarding experimental aviation technology for decades. His report would either validate Chen's innovative approach or establish precedents that discouraged technological development outside official channels. The investigation that had begun as routine compliance enforcement had evolved into strategic assessment of how aviation safety could be maintained while allowing innovation necessary for continued advancement in commercial aviation capabilities that served growing passenger volumes across expanding route networks. The afternoon brought additional complications as Boeing Field's operations manager received inquiries from airline executives who had heard about the previous night's successful approaches through weather conditions that typically grounded commercial aviation. 3 major carriers wanted immediate installation of similar approach lighting systems at airports serving their primary hubs, creating demand for technology that remained under federal investigation for regulatory violations. The operational success that Chen had demonstrated was generating commercial interest that complicated regulatory decisions about whether unauthorized innovations should be permitted or prohibited, regardless of performance advantages. As evening approached, Chen waited in his basement workshop while federal investigators deliberated over technology that had proven itself operationally but challenged institutional frameworks designed to ensure aviation safety through systematic oversight rather than experimental validation. His illegal wiring had accomplished everything he had promised, but success didn't guarantee regulatory approval in systems where bureaucratic caution often overwhelmed engineering innovation. The decision that emerged would determine whether American aviation could embrace technological advancement or remain constrained by approval processes that prioritized institutional control over operational improvement. The telephone rang in Chen's basement workshop at 6:15 p.m., cutting through the electrical hum of testing equipment that had operated continuously for 36 hours since Flight 23's successful landing. Inspector Garrison's voice carried none of the bureaucratic hostility that Chen had expected after a day of federal investigation into his unauthorized electrical modifications. Instead, the FAA compliance officer spoke with the measured tone of a man who had discovered something that challenged his professional assumptions about regulatory oversight versus operational necessity. "Your approach lighting system presents an unusual situation," Garrison began, his words carefully chosen to avoid commitments that federal policy hadn't yet authorized. "The technical evaluation reveals capabilities that exceed approved systems currently operating at commercial airports. However, the regulatory violations remain significant and cannot be dismissed regardless of operational performance. Chen understood the implications immediately. Success didn't guarantee approval in bureaucratic systems where procedural compliance often outweighed practical results. The engineering documentation that Garrison had reviewed throughout the afternoon revealed design sophistication that contradicted typical assumptions about unauthorized modifications found at commercial aviation facilities. Chen's electromagnetic guidance system represented months of systematic development that addressed safety concerns through redundant circuits, interference shielding, and failure mode analysis that exceeded certification requirements for officially approved approach lighting installations. The mathematical calculations supporting radio frequency selection, power distribution, and electromagnetic compatibility demonstrated professional competence that challenged regulatory frameworks designed to prevent amateur experimentation with safety-critical aviation systems. Behind the technical specifications lay broader questions about how rapidly American aviation technology could evolve when institutional approval processes required years of certification for innovations that demonstrated immediate operational benefits. Chen's approach lighting had prevented potential disasters during a single storm, proving capabilities that commercial airlines desperately needed as passenger volumes increased and route networks expanded into airports where weather conditions frequently grounded aircraft equipped with conventional navigation systems. The disconnect between engineering capability and regulatory approval created tensions that extended throughout America's growing aviation industry. Major airlines had been quietly developing their own experimental navigation systems, operating under similar regulatory ambiguity, while seeking technological solutions to operational problems that killed passengers and destroyed aircraft when approved systems proved inadequate under adverse conditions. United Airlines had been testing radio beacon installations at Denver that violated federal regulations but provided altitude guidance through mountain weather that defeated conventional approach procedures. American Airlines operated experimental lighting at Chicago that created visual references during snowstorms, when approved systems became invisible to pilots attempting instrument approaches through precipitation that scattered traditional light patterns. The aviation industry was evolving faster than regulatory frameworks could accommodate, creating situations where operational safety demanded technological capabilities that exceeded officially approved systems. Chen's approach lighting represented one example of engineering innovation that challenged institutional control mechanisms designed to ensure safety through systematic oversight rather than experimental validation. The Federal Aviation Authority faced fundamental decisions about whether to embrace rapid technological development or maintain bureaucratic caution that prioritized procedural compliance over operational improvement in rapidly expanding commercial aviation markets. Garrison's investigation had revealed similar unauthorized installations at airports across America, creating a pattern of regulatory violation that suggested systematic inadequacy in approved technology rather than widespread disregard for federal oversight. Seattle's success with electromagnetic guidance had been replicated at facilities in Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and Los Angeles, where engineers had independently developed solutions to navigation problems that approved systems couldn't address under weather conditions that occurred routinely throughout commercial aviation operations. The unauthorized modifications represented distributed innovation that was advancing aviation safety faster than federal approval processes could recognize or regulate. The technical data collected during Chen's system operation showed performance characteristics that exceeded specifications for approved approach lighting by margins that couldn't be explained through minor improvements or calibration adjustments. Navigation accuracy was 3 times better than certified systems. Visibility penetration through adverse weather was 40% superior to conventional installations. Most significantly, electromagnetic interference that had motivated federal regulations proved non-existent when proper electrical isolation techniques prevented signal contamination that could affect aircraft instruments during critical approach phases when navigation loss would prove catastrophic. Chen's engineering had solved problems that had challenged aviation technology for decades, creating electromagnetic guidance that provided precision approaches through weather conditions that grounded aircraft equipped with approved systems. His calculations had transformed theoretical possibilities into operational reality through systematic development that proceeded without institutional support or official recognition. The success demonstrated what individual innovation could accomplish when regulatory constraints were bypassed in favor of direct engineering solutions to operational problems that affected passenger safety and commercial aviation efficiency. The broader implications extended beyond Seattle's municipal airport into strategic questions about American aviation's technological competitiveness in global markets, where rapid innovation determined commercial advantage. European airlines were developing navigation systems that exceeded American-approved technology, creating operational capabilities that attracted passengers and cargo to carriers that could maintain schedules through weather conditions that grounded American aircraft equipped with regulatory-compliant but technologically inferior guidance systems. The institutional caution that had motivated federal oversight was inadvertently constraining American aviation advancement, while international competitors embraced technological development that prioritized operational capability over bureaucratic approval. Inspector Garrison's preliminary report would influence federal policy regarding experimental aviation technology for years, establishing precedents that either encouraged or discouraged innovation outside official channels. His conclusions would determine whether Chen's approach lighting represented the future of night aviation or dangerous precedent that undermined safety protocols designed to prevent unauthorized modifications that could create catastrophic failures under operational conditions. The investigation had evolved from routine compliance enforcement into strategic assessment of how aviation safety could be maintained, while allowing innovation necessary for continued American leadership in commercial aviation technology. The evening brought additional pressure as airline executives arrived at Boeing Field, demanding immediate access to approach lighting technology that had demonstrated capabilities their operations desperately needed. Northwest Airlines President Donald Nyrop had flown personally from Minneapolis after receiving reports about Flight 23's successful landing through weather that had grounded aircraft at every other airport in the Pacific Northwest. His presence at Seattle represented commercial interests that would influence federal decisions about experimental technology, regardless of regulatory concerns about unauthorized installations. Pan American Airways had dispatched their chief engineer from New York with authorization to purchase Chen's approach lighting system immediately, offering compensation that exceeded federal fines for regulatory violations by substantial margins. The commercial demand for electromagnetic guidance technology created market pressures that complicated regulatory decisions about whether unauthorized innovations should be permitted or prohibited based on bureaucratic compliance rather than operational performance. American airlines were prepared to invest millions in navigation systems that worked rather than approved technology that failed under conditions where passengers expected reliable service. Chen found himself at the center of conflicts between engineering innovation, regulatory oversight, and commercial necessity that would determine how American aviation technology advanced in rapidly evolving global markets. His illegal wiring had accomplished everything he had promised, but success created new problems as federal authorities struggled to balance institutional control against operational requirements that demanded technological capabilities exceeding approved systems. The decision that emerged would establish whether American aviation could embrace innovation or remain constrained by approval processes that prioritize bureaucratic caution over engineering advancement. As midnight approached on March 14th, Chen waited in his workshop while federal investigators, airline executives, and airport administrators debated technology that had proven itself operationally but challenged regulatory frameworks designed to ensure safety through systematic oversight. His electromagnetic guidance system represented more than unauthorized electrical connections. It embodied fundamental questions about how rapidly aviation technology could evolve when institutional approval processes moved slower than engineering innovation that solved operational problems affecting passenger safety and commercial aviation efficiency throughout America's expanding airline network. The Federal Aviation Authority's emergency meeting convened at 7:30 a.m. on March 15th in a sterile conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucratic anxiety. Regional Director Thomas Whitman sat at the head of a polished table surrounded by technical advisors, safety inspectors, and legal counsel who had been summoned to address what internal memos described as the Seattle incident. For 48 hours, unauthorized electromagnetic guidance technology had operated at a commercial airport without federal oversight, creating precedent that threatened institutional control over aviation safety standards that had been written in the blood of pilots who had tested experimental systems under conditions where failure meant death. Whitman possessed the methodical bearing of a career bureaucrat who understood that regulatory frameworks existed to prevent exactly the kind of experimental modifications that Chen had implemented without official approval. His 23 years with the Federal Aviation Authority had taught him that deviation from established safety protocols created failure modes that killed passengers regardless of engineering intentions or operational success. The wire-rimmed glasses perched on his narrow nose reflected harsh fluorescent lighting as he reviewed incident reports that documented perfect system performance, alongside comprehensive regulatory violations that could not be ignored regardless of results. Inspector Garrison presented his technical findings with clinical precision that transformed Chen's electromagnetic guidance system from unauthorized modification into case study of regulatory inadequacy versus engineering innovation. His photographs showed electrical connections that violated specific federal regulations, while demonstrating professional competence that exceeded certification requirements for approved approach lighting installations currently operating at major airports throughout America's commercial aviation network. The mathematical calculations supporting radio frequency selection, power distribution, and electromagnetic compatibility revealed systematic development that had proceeded without institutional support, but achieved capabilities that officially approved systems could not match under adverse weather conditions. The safety record spoke with irrefutable authority that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between regulatory compliance and operational security in rapidly evolving aviation technology. 3 aircraft had completed successful approaches through weather conditions that would have forced diversions or, worse, using approved systems, demonstrating guidance accuracy that exceeded specifications for certified installations by margins that couldn't be explained through calibration adjustments or operational variations. Most significantly, electromagnetic interference concerns that had motivated federal regulations proved unfounded when proper electrical isolation techniques prevented signal contamination that could affect aircraft instruments during critical approach phases. Behind the technical specifications lay broader implications that extended throughout America's expanding aviation industry, where commercial airlines were quietly developing experimental navigation systems under similar regulatory ambiguity, while seeking technological solutions to operational problems that approved systems couldn't address. United Airlines had reported similar unauthorized installations at Denver that provided altitude guidance through mountain weather conditions that defeated conventional approach procedures. American Airlines operated experimental lighting at Chicago that created visual references during snowstorms when approved systems became invisible to pilots attempting instrument approaches through precipitation that scattered traditional light patterns beyond recognition. The pattern suggested systematic inadequacy in approved technology rather than widespread disregard for federal oversight among aviation professionals who understood safety requirements better than bureaucratic administrators who had never operated aircraft under conditions where navigation failure meant catastrophic consequences. Engineers across the country were independently developing solutions to problems that killed pilots and passengers while waiting for approval processes that moved with institutional deliberation rather than operational urgency that measured lives against regulatory compliance procedures. Legal counsel. Margaret Foster raised concerns that transcended technical performance into liability frameworks that could expose the Federal Aviation Authority to lawsuits if unauthorized systems failed under operational conditions. Her Harvard Law education provided context for regulatory decisions that balanced innovation encouragement against institutional protection from consequences that experimental technology might create when theoretical calculations proved inadequate for real-world applications. If Chen's approach lighting system experienced catastrophic failure during commercial operations, federal investigators would face congressional hearings questioning why unauthorized modifications had been permitted to operate without completing mandatory safety certification protocols. The commercial pressures complicated regulatory decisions as airline executives continued arriving at Boeing Field with demands for immediate access to electromagnetic guidance technology that their operations desperately needed for maintaining schedules through weather conditions that grounded aircraft equipped with approved but inadequate navigation systems. Northwest Airlines had already initiated engineering studies for system installation at Minneapolis, while Pan American Airways was offering substantial compensation for technology that exceeded federal fines for regulatory violations by margins that transformed compliance issues into business decisions rather than safety considerations. Technical advisor Dr. Richard Hayes presented mathematical analysis that revealed uncomfortable truths about approved approach lighting capabilities compared to Chen's unauthorized electromagnetic guidance system. His MIT engineering background provided framework for calculations that showed certified installations failed to provide adequate navigation references under weather conditions that occurred routinely throughout commercial aviation operations, creating situations where regulatory compliance actually increased operational risks rather than ensuring passenger safety through systematic oversight of aviation technology development. The performance data collected during Seattle's storm operations documented guidance accuracy that was 3 times better than approved systems, visibility penetration through adverse weather that exceeded certified installations by 40%, and electromagnetic compatibility that eliminated interference concerns while providing navigation precision that pilots had never experienced with conventional approach lighting. The numbers spoke with mathematical certainty that challenged institutional frameworks designed to ensure safety through bureaucratic control rather than technological capability. Director Whitman faced decisions that would establish precedents affecting aviation technology development for decades, determining whether federal regulations would encourage innovation necessary for continued American leadership in commercial aviation or maintain institutional control that prioritized procedural compliance over operational advancement in rapidly evolving global markets. European airlines were developing navigation systems that exceeded American-approved technology, creating competitive advantages that attracted passengers to carriers capable of maintaining schedules through weather conditions that grounded American aircraft equipped with regulatory compliant but technologically inferior guidance systems. The emergency session continued through morning hours as federal officials struggled with conflicts between engineering innovation, regulatory oversight, and commercial necessity that reflected broader challenges facing industries where technological advancement occurred faster than institutional frameworks could adapt to changing operational realities. Chen's electromagnetic guidance represented more than unauthorized electrical connections. It embodied fundamental questions about how aviation safety could be maintained, while allowing innovation that solved operational problems affecting passenger welfare and commercial aviation efficiency throughout America's expanding airline network. Inspector Garrison's supplementary report revealed additional installations at airports across America, creating a distributed pattern of regulatory violation that suggested systematic engineering response to approved technology inadequacies, rather than isolated disregard for federal oversight among aviation professionals who understood operational requirements better than bureaucratic administrators. The unauthorized modifications represented innovation network that was advancing aviation safety faster than approval processes could recognize, evaluate, or integrate into regulatory frameworks that had been designed for slower technological development cycles. The afternoon brought testimony from pilots who had experienced Chen's electromagnetic guidance system during actual operations, providing operational perspective that transcended technical specifications into practical assessment of navigation capabilities under conditions where approved systems had proven inadequate. Captain Mitchell's detailed account of Flight 23's approach through weather that would have forced diversion using conventional lighting demonstrated system reliability that exceeded approved installations while providing guidance precision that eliminated uncertainty during critical phases when navigation accuracy determined whether aircraft reached runways safely or became accident statistics. The pilot testimony revealed broader operational context that bureaucratic analysis had missed, showing how Chen's innovation addressed real problems that affected passenger safety and commercial aviation efficiency, rather than representing theoretical improvement that looked sophisticated on engineering drawings, but provided marginal benefit under actual operating conditions. The electromagnetic guidance had transformed impossible approaches into routine operations, creating capabilities that commercial airlines desperately needed as passenger volumes increased and route networks expanded into airports where weather conditions frequently challenged conventional navigation systems beyond their operational limits. As evening approached, Director Whitman prepared recommendations that would determine whether Chen's approach lighting represented the future of night aviation, or dangerous precedent that undermined regulatory frameworks designed to prevent unauthorized modifications of safety-critical systems. The decision emerging from federal deliberations would establish whether American aviation could embrace technological innovation or remain constrained by approval processes that moved slower than engineering advancement necessary for maintaining competitive advantage in global markets where operational capability determined commercial success. The decision that emerged from the Federal Aviation Authority's emergency deliberations would echo through aviation history with consequences that extended far beyond Robert Chen's basement workshop in Seattle. On March 16, 1938, Director Whitman signed Federal Aviation Directive 127B, establishing emergency certification protocols that allowed experimental navigation systems to operate under provisional approval while completing accelerated safety evaluation procedures. Chen's illegal wiring had not merely guided 3 aircraft to safe landings through impossible weather conditions. It had forced institutional recognition that regulatory frameworks must evolve as rapidly as the technology they governed, or risk constraining innovation that could save lives rather than endangering them. Within 18 months, electromagnetic approach lighting systems based on Chen's unauthorized design were operating at 47 airports across America, transforming night aviation from weather-dependent gamble into reliable transportation that functioned regardless of visibility conditions. The mathematical precision that had guided Flight 23 through Seattle's storm became standard capability that allowed commercial aviation to maintain schedules through conditions that had previously grounded aircraft and stranded passengers. Chen's stubborn conviction that properly designed electrical circuits could solve aviation's most dangerous limitation had proven correct through operational success that transcended bureaucratic approval processes. The broader implications reach beyond technical achievement into fundamental questions about how rapidly American technology could advance when engineers possessed courage to challenge institutional limitations that prioritized regulatory compliance over operational necessity. Chen's approach lighting represented what individual innovation could accomplish when mathematical certainty overcame bureaucratic caution, creating capabilities that saved lives while establishing precedents for technological development that would define American aviation leadership throughout the 20th century, the century that followed his illegal wiring experiment in a Seattle basement.